Hi, I'm Steve Green. I've had a few requests off a previous video I posted for creation of a simple plugin. Following on from that was a request through my YouTube channel, but also pointing to a particular post on the Microsoft forums for doing calculations within a plugin. And as you can see on screen, Sanjeeb has a question regarding creation of with an account entity with three custom fields on, which are decimals, service A, service B, service C, and a new total, which is a money field. And then I think he wanted just to approve the process and show how it's done. Add these together and divide by 80 and store it in the total. So I'll do that as the first part of this video, and then the second part we'll be looking at retrieving the associated incidents and taking the discount price off the incident field, totaling it up and subtracting it from this new total to give an overall value, I suppose, of the services minus whatever it's cost you for the cases. So I'll begin by showing you within CRM. I've already on the account entity, so if I look at this demo account from the previous video, once that opens, again I'm down a VPN tunnel from home to the office, so it's a little bit slower than normal. So on this form I've created a new section which has got this service A, service B, service C fields, which are decimals to 2 decimal places, I think they are. Yeah, so 2 DP. With the service total, which will do the sum of these three fields, divide by 80, and put it into service total. And then in the further part of the video, I'll show you how to retrieve the associated cases, the discount price, which I can show you on a case now what I've added. So if I create a new case record, I've added this other money field to the case, which is obviously what will take all those values of all associated cases and subtract from, wrong record. Subtract from this service total. Well, we'll sum all the incidents, discount prices, put them in this total box, subtract that from the service total to get a final cost. Okay, so if we go to Visual Studio, obviously if you want to look at one of my earlier videos for the creation of a simple plugin, I go through the process of initially setting up the solution from the developer toolkit to pick the correct template, add the to strongly sign the assemblies, etc., and deploy it for the first time. So I'll open that previous solution, which will take a couple of seconds. And what we'll be doing is creating a new plugin, and we'll register it pre-event. So we can see this is the previous solution with the package. It's got a plugins project which has been strongly signed, and we've got a previous plugin I did in that first video, the Silverlight application, which we can ignore. And then I did another video on a custom workflow assembly, but that's not part of this video. So we need to create a new plugin to register. What we'll do is it will be pre-event, because I find that if you want to manipulate values on the current record, if you're to do them post-event, obviously the data's already been written to the database, and if you then want to update values within that same record, you've got to do a subsequent update, which is going to trigger your plugin again if it's registered on an update message, which we will for this because we'll need to do it on a create and an update, and that subsequent update will trigger the same plugin, which will cause the update again, and so on and so forth. So you end up having to trap for it by looking at the context.depth property and making sure it's less than 1 or 2. But I just think it's a very inefficient way to code your plugin, because it's always going to be called at least twice, even if it drops out in the very early stages by checking the context.depth. It's still, the platform still instantiated it twice, and I think it's far better to use pre-operation and then just add to the attribute collection or modify the existing attributes in the attributes collection and let the main database operation pass the context to it, and it will just write it to the database. So if we get started by add a new item, a class, obviously we'll give it a descript name, so total service values on account. So again, this is the empty shell of the class library. Again, as I've stated before, there's nothing specific to CRM at this point. The references are already available from with the DLLs from the SDK. So we need to add a using statement for the Microsoft.xrm.sdk namespace, which will allow us then to implement the iPlugin interface. We need to set the access modifier again of the class to public, and then implement the interface, which will get the empty execute method with a not implemented exception by default, which we can delete. What I'll probably do is take the code, which I say it's all fairly standard, the starting point, where we instantiate the context and the tracing service, etc. So if I'll probably copy the whole lot and just delete the business logic. May have got one too many closing braces there. So I need to add system.service model namespace. We've already got the tracing service uncommented, so I can delete this previous logic. So what we have here again is the context extracted from the service provider parameter, a tracing service which we're not really going to be utilizing but can be useful for diagnostic tracing, so I could put a trace.trace method and put about to do something with we're further in the business logic, and then if it crashed or threw an exception at that point, we can see in the diagnostics output that it reached the point just before it, so we got a rough idea where it's failing. So yeah, we've instantiated a entity reference but set it to null. We're checking if the input parameters collection contains something called target, and if it's of type entity, and then obviously again we're casting that late bound target as an entity to that entity reference. We'll be doing this obviously on a create and an update, so whether you want to actually just remove the message name checks, and obviously this we added one previously for checking if it's on the account. So if we do an OR here, because we'll be doing that, I say, on an update as well. Update, sorry. Yeah, sorry, that shouldn't be an OR, that should be an AND. So if it's not equal to create and not equal to update, then end, return, so it'll gracefully end. Okay, so what we'll do is, because this is obviously going to be on the account entity, we can take the late bound entity type and cast it to an early bound account. But before we do that, because I've added these fields since we generated the early bound class library, we need to regenerate that. So I need to go to my extracted SDK, into the bin folder, cd bin, then CRM SVC util, URL of the organization service. So this is my dev server. It's on the default port, so I don't need to specify one. It's on port 80. The organization name, sorry, which is CRM demo. XRM services /2011/organization.svc. The output file name, so it's CRM demo earlybound.cs. The namespace, which we can look at the top of our, so it's CRM demo.plugins. Obviously the case is important, and the service context name, which you'll see where this is used in the later part of this video for when we're doing querying. It gives us access to the LINQ provider and the early bound data sets. So in this case we'll call it CRM demo context, but we'll come on to that. Obviously in my example, because again I'm on a machine that's not joined to the domain, I need to specify a username and password. If you were on premise in your office, you wouldn't need to do this. Okay, so that's going to take a few minutes down the VPN tunnel, so I'll pop this on pause. Okay, that's completed. It took a few minutes, as I stated. So that's now output the early bound class library, which I now need to replace the previous one that didn't have the newly created fields. So it's always important to know if you do any customizations, add any fields, and you want to be able to reference them in code, early bound, you have to regenerate that library. So if I delete the previous version, right click the solution, add existing item, browse to my SDK. So say if you in the output property of the utility, you could have specified an alternative path, but I didn't. So if I add that, we'll now, if we cast or use the to entity method, so we can say the current account that's been passed in as part of the context, and change the entity to entity account. So now we'll have access to all of the properties of the account that was passed in from the context. The reason I much prefer to use early bound, and I strongly advise it for yourself, is you don't have to know all the field names off by heart, and also the data types. So everything's strongly typed, so you can't try and pass the wrong data type or store the wrong data type in a particular property, which with late bound you have to know what the data type is and cast values before you can write to it and so on, or when you extract values from the entity you have to cast them. So it's just a lot safer, and there's a slight performance hit, but if you're starting to worry about those kind of negligible performance hits, you probably need to get out more. So now we need to do the calculation. So we've got 3 decimals, which we're going to total, divide that total by 80 and store it in the total field. So we could define a few decimal variables. So we could say the service A equals current account dot. I think in the example, or the question rather, that was posted, he used the prefix new, but obviously because I've deployed this under my Feline Soft publisher, they'll begin with FSO, but obviously if you've created them under just the default solution, they would start with new, most probably, unless you've changed that. So now we've got service A. Obviously it's a nullable type, so it's grumbling that it can't convert a nullable type decimal to decimal, so you have to use the value property. And then if we repeat that for the other two, FSO service B dot value, I mean, you could directly use the sort of the early bound property within your sum, but for clarity, I think it helps to store the values before you utilize them. So we've stored now the 3 service values from the entity into these new value types. Now to do the actual calculation, we could obviously, sorry, if I just do a new total, and we can default that to 0. Obviously that M is the symbol for a decimal, but now we could say the total equals service A plus service B plus service C. Oh, I missed the underscore, sorry. So now in memory we've got a value type total, which has got the total of them summed. Obviously we could do the division within that same formula above, but just for clarity of the video, so we can say equals total divided by 80. And now we need to write that back to the total field. So at the moment that will be null because this is on a create, well, obviously it can be create and update, but we need from the current account FSO total field, sorry, service total field equals that value. But if you look, it's the IntelliSense is grumbling because that service total was a money field, and obviously we're trying to pass a decimal in, which if you'd done this late bound, it would have happily let you do that. Obviously you would have referenced this with square brackets and then the logical name, which would be a lowercase version as a string, and you wouldn't have known until runtime that this wasn't valid, and it would have thrown an exception. So what I need to do is create a new money reference type, and obviously it takes as a single overloaded method. Well, sorry, it's an overloaded method. One of them takes decimal value, which is total, and then that will pass that into service total. And we don't need to do any kind of update now because we're pre-operation, so it's before CRM actually writes the data to the database. By just updating this attribute within the entity attribute collection, the platform will then just write that to the database, and that's the niceness, is that, if that's a word, of doing a pre-operation versus post, where now you'd be doing an update, which could will, if you have this registered on an update message, would have caused it to trigger again, and you'd have to be trapping at the top for a context.depth greater than 1. And I just think that's a very messy way of working. So now we're ready to deploy this, but I haven't yet added this new class library to the register file. So if I double click that, we can see the previous create task simple plugin we did, but we need to create an additional plugin step for the total service values on account class. So what I can do is copy that plugin section, paste it. I can remove the step because we'll do that using the CRM Explorer. Overwrite the simple name, so something like calculate service totals or service total. Copy that to the friendly name. Obviously we need to replace this with the total service values on account, which are probably easier to copy from the actual class. And the same with the type name. And then obviously if what I need to do is blank this GUID. So that needs to be 8 for the first set, 4 another 4, and then there's 12 at the end. That's 10, so 8, 4, 4, 4, 12. So that's now ready to deploy to the platform. So if I right click on the package, deploy, this will take a few minutes again because now the solution is it's grown quite a bit with the 2 early bound class libraries in the workflow and plugin solution. The class libraries are fairly negligible, it's mainly those early bound class libraries, so I'll just pop this on pause. Okay, so that's finished deploying. As I stated in the previous video, because I had the register file open, it's prompted to say that it's been modified outside of this editor, and if we reload we should see we've now got the GUID. So if I were to go to my CRM and go to my solution, open the solution, expand my plugin assemblies and expand my plugins, I should see the additional calculate service total has appeared. So now obviously we registered the additional class as part of that assembly, but we need to now create the actual message step, and for this there's going to be 2. We need to do a create and an update step. So if I expand plugins, there's our new plugin, calculate service total. If I expand it, we don't have any steps. So right click, add step, click that. It's an account, so click that, take a few seconds to retrieve the available messages. Quicker obviously on premise or probably on CRM Online. Message create for this first message in the context of the calling user, as I previously stated, pre-operation, so that it will pass the context with the additional property through to the main database operation, and then server only. We won't, obviously we don't need to do a pre-image or anything for a create, because all attributes will be submitted, but we will need to, in a second I'll show you with the update message, that we'll need to do a pre-image and take some of the service parameters, and I'll explain why once I get to that point. So if I OK that, we see the extra step there, and as part of the extra step appears in the XML for the register file. So now if I do the update step, so again pick the primary entity account, message update, same within the context of the calling user, pre-operation, and what we can specify on an update is which attributes would trigger the update message, and it's good practice to limit this to just the attributes that, otherwise if the account name changed it will trigger this plugin, which is very inefficient. It's got nothing to do with the account name or any of these other fields, so it's best to deselect, find our custom fields, so they're going to be under the display names. So we're only interested if the service A, service B or service C values change, so that it calculates a new service total. So I can OK that. So now that plugin on an update message will only trigger if any one of those three values is altered, or all of them. I won't do the image at this point. I'll show you the issues that arise on an update message that differs from a create. So if I OK that, we'll get our prompt again. Yes. We can see the additional XML in the register file. So now if I deploy again, I'll just pop it on pause. Okay, so that's now deployed. So if I go back to CRM, to the solution, and we go to the message processing steps, we can see the two additional steps now, both pre-operation for the create and update messages. So now if I go to the account area and we create a new account, so let's just call this service totals account. If I populate, so these values, 4,000, the reason I chose those is because they'll total 8,000, and obviously with the division by 80 we should get a easy to work out service total. So if I save, now that's going to trigger our plugin, and to review, we extract the values, sum them together, divide by 80 and write it back to the service total field. So if I hit save, it'll cache the assembly, which takes a few seconds. And if I scroll down, so our 8,000 divided by 80, service total has written our money value of 100. Now what I'll show you is the reason why we'll need to use the pre-entity image on the update step, because now we've got this pre-existing account. If I was to update, so it's registered on the update to trigger on any three of these values. So if I were to change the email address and save, oh sorry, bad example, change the account number, put an account number in, save, that won't trigger our plugin. Not that that'd be easy to tell because the values would have been exactly the same anyway. But if I now change, say, that value to 1,000 and save, this will trigger our plugin, which should sum the three values, divide by 80, so it should be 7,000 divided by 80, whatever that will equate to. But you'll see we get a business process error, I believe, because that will be, we're trying to extract the value of the other two service values, and they're null, because I'll show you the reason why. So really in our code we should have checked that these have values for trying to actually read the value out of them. So we should have done a check for service A, service B and service C if they're not null. So if this nullable type is not equal to null, then we can set the first one, the first service A value type to the value, and I'll repeat. Easier to copy it. Same again for C. So we don't want the value, we just want the attribute itself. Okay, so now it's griping because these aren't initialized. So what I will do, sorry for this, this is warts and all. If we define these outside of the if and initialize them to nothing, I'll do the same for B and C. Oops, sorry, C. And now obviously we're just modifying existing value types. Okay, sorry about that, it was a bit of a warts and all, but you saw throw an exception. So we've initialized these to 0, then if the attribute within the entity is not null, we're taking the value and updating this value type, and then doing a total that we've initialized, summing them. So I'll deploy that again, just pop it on pause. Okay, that's deployed again. I should really close this register file so we don't keep getting prompted about that. So my bad code to start with, I've now done a check to see if the values are not null before I attempt to access the value property, because obviously it throws that exception. So if I return to our account, so because it threw an exception, this is still in an unsaved state. So the 1000 we tried to commit. So now if I show you, click save, it'll load the new version of the plugin. And now you can see, and you're thinking, why is that £12.50 when 7,000 divided by 80 should be in the 80s somewhere, 87.5 or something. The reason is because we haven't changed service A and service B. On an update, only the values that you've changed are part of the collection. So the context that's passed in for the update will only contain service C's new value of 1000. So within our calculation, we've extracted the entity class from the update message. We've initialized these internal variables. Service A will be null, so it won't write anything to there because that's not part of the update message because it hasn't been altered. Likewise, service B will be null, so it won't update this value of 0. But service C, well, it's got the value of 1000, so you'll end up with a sum of 0 plus 1000 divided by 80, which is giving us the £12.50. So what we need to do on the update is register. So if we edit this step, so expand CRM Explorer, find our update step, edit. It's taking a few seconds. So now what we need to do is create a pre-image. So before it obviously reaches the pre-operation stage, it's going to produce this image of the entity. So before obviously we manipulate it in code, so we can say, we'll just call this pre-image, and we need to define what parameters we wish to capture. excuse me. So if I go down and I say service A, service B, service C, so this, what the platform will do is it will, in the pre-entity images collection as part of the input parameters, I think it's the input parameters, I'll show you in a second, it will pass in what the values were before any of the plugins have started to manipulate. So what we can do, so that's modified that step. If we look at the register file just to show you, it's added this images node, or image, and with the image node, and it's going to take this pre-entity image and pass those values in. So what we can do once we've got the entity extracted, we can do a check if the context pre-entity, sorry, it's not input parameters, it's the pre-entity images collection contains, and do a search for the image. So by name, we just called it pre-image, capital P, capital I. So if that contains, it returns a bool, so this if will be true. So we can create a new entity, pre-entity equals cast the pre-entity image, then obviously looking for the key, which is pre-image. Let's take the speech marks as well. So that's now going to, obviously the entity that's stored in the pre-entity image called pre-image that we just defined in this step will now be cast into this pre-entity late bound type. And what we can then do, so all that will contain is service A, service B and service C before they're manipulated. So if we've only updated a single value, we need to get hold of the other two values, or if two were updated and one wasn't, we need to get access to the missing one. So if we do a for each and iterate through all the attributes, within that pre-entity image, so every single attribute in a late bound type, it's only the attributes that will have been that you've defined. So there won't be the account name, for instance. It will only contain the three attributes we've defined. So we can check to see if the entity attributes collection already contains the value. So if this already contains service C, we don't want to take the value before it was updated, because obviously it'll just write it back to what it was before we've done the update message. But the missing ones we do wish to extract. I hope this is making sense. So if entity attributes dot contains and then so if it doesn't, this is the key is the name of it, so FSO underscore service A, FSO underscore service B. So if it does contain, we're not interested. We're saying if it doesn't, so if the message that's been passed in doesn't already contain one of these attributes, we want to add it to this entity attributes collection. So and then pass it the value of the attribute. So hopefully that makes some sense. So if I recap, during an update message it will only contain the modified attributes, So when I showed you, we updated a single value, which was service C. Service B and A and B were missing, therefore the calculation was skewed. And obviously, if you didn't know that was the issue, you'd have people would be scratching their heads wondering why the formula is wrong or not even noticing. So what we've done, we've added a pre-entity image to the update message, and we check whether that's present within the input message, within the entity that's been passed in from the context. If not, add that attribute and its value. So if I now, and then that gets obviously cast into an account type, etc., and it extracts these values. So if I deploy again, pop you on pause. Okay, that's deployed. So if I go back to our service totals account test record, obviously before we changed the 2000 to 1000, we did save and we got this strange result. So if I put it back to 2000, now because that's the only value again that's been updated, that will be the only value passed in the context and the update message, but the pre-entity image will pass the other two values in. So if I save, now we see the correct original 8000 divided by 80. If I put that back to 1000 and save, just to show you what it should have been with the correct calculation. So now we've got our £87.50. So that completes sort of part one. What I'll do is I'll split this video into two, because I think it's already up to over 40 minutes and some people's brains may have melted by now. So I'll continue the next part, which is going to be, I'll show you a couple of different query types, query expressions, and using the LINQ provider, using the service context name we output as part of the early bound class. So I'll see you in part two. Thanks.